Diablo 4, for the most part, plays very well. Overall, I'm very positive about this game. If you're looking for my by far biggest point of concern, then skip ahead to the dungeons. But as far as this question of Diablo identity is concerned, the world looks and feels amazing. I played Diablo 2 when I was 12 years old. The game blew me away and it was genre defining. Roughly 10 years later, Diablo 3 came out and there were a couple of things off. Things that couldn't really immerse me into the world as much. The colors were too bright, the enemies in the whole world didn't feel dark enough, and the storytelling and the overall immersion just wasn't that good. I remember one of the bosses, Asmodan, who was constantly taunting you from some sort of vision, trying to convince himself more than anyone else that his evil plans were still on track despite the player making progress. It was so silly. In an epic story about the clash between the heavens and the hells, where you play this brave mortal who shouldn't even have a chance of defeating Diablo himself, there's Asmodan. Diablo 3 bosses like Asmodan were giving the player too much respect. As a player in a Diablo world, you want to feel small. A demon of that significance is not taunting you. It kind of dispels the fantasy the game wants to sell you. In Diablo 2, you would never see the final boss of an act until the moment you walked into the boss room. Maybe this was just because of game development limitations at the time, but it worked. It was so immersive. You only learned about the Act 1 boss Andariel through dialogues and lore. You were shitting your pants because you never knew when you'd run into her, what she looked like, and how fast you'd die when you'd finally have to fight her. That's immersive, in my opinion. Diablo 4 is doing many things right and some things great. Lilith is believable. It's a villain you want to know more about, and you feel invested in the story right from the start, with the cinematic in the church being very impactful in pulling you into the story and making you understand why it's important to chase her down and stop her. The cutscenes, the cinematics, the voice acting, the environmental storytelling, and pieces of lore you'll find around the world are all very effective in supporting the story and in making you believe and care about the world you play in. It also looks like a true Diablo game. It's very dark, lots of blood and gore, occult rituals, possessed villagers, plenty of demons and monsters. All of the above are Diablo staples, and the art direction feels on point. The open world also adds a lot, and I think this is where Diablo 4 will surpass Diablo 2. The open world is so well done, with many different regions, climates that will gradually change as you travel through the world, items that will look different depending on where you found them. It's not just a good looking backdrop to play the game in. Elements such as story and itemization back up the fantasy that this open world is selling. The main storyline is also built with the open world in mind. One of the main characters, Lorith Nar, is part of the Horadrim, an ancient order of scholars and mages sworn to protect Sanctuary, that's the Diablo world, from demons. He guides you to the first big city, and when you arrive there, he tells you to track down some clues about Lilith. This is the Act 1 storyline. But he also talks about Donan, who is another member of the Horadrim, and he needs to be warned about Lilith. Alerting Donan is the start of Act 2. You can check this on the map, and he's in Skosklen, I believe it's called, and that's in the north part of the map. It's a completely different region of the world. Lorith leaves you in Kyovashat, that's the name of the city that you first arrive in, because he himself has to go to the dry steppes. Okay, lore alert. All the way on the other side of the world, and meeting up with him will be the start of Act 3. So the point is that from the very start of the game, you'll have a sense of the expansiveness of this world, and these are not just fancy regions that you eventually end up in. There is relevance to these. Like the world has meaning, and it has very specific meaning for you and the campaign mission. So yeah, that's what I really liked about it. If you've played Diablo 1, 2, or 3, you'll know who Deckard Cain is. He's one of the most iconic characters in the Diablo franchise, and he was always in town or around the campfire when you got back to town, and he would say, "Stay a while and listen." He was the Urodrim scholar whose wisdom you trusted, and when he said, "Okay, we need to go here and stop this demon, otherwise the world will plummet into darkness," you would do as he said. As iconic as that guy was, Diablo 3 kind of did him dirty because he felt more like a meme instead of a serious character there. Lorith Nar looks like the new Deckard Cain, and I think he's perfect for this. He has the gravitas needed for a character like that, and I hope we'll see him evolve as a serious part of the Diablo lore going forward. There's much more to say about Diablo 4, but I just wanted to touch on some topics that I thought were important, and I haven't really heard others talk about that much. But to answer the question I started out with, Diablo 4 looks very promising. It looks like a worthy successor in the franchise, and as far as I'm concerned, even has the potential to be something better than the elusive gold standard that Diablo 4 was, at least in terms of story and world building. By the way, if you've enjoyed the video so far, please like it and consider subscribing. Apart from the Diablo identity and the action RPG elements we'll get into in a little bit, I expect Diablo 4 to be a fun hack and slash game. Combat is the main gameplay element, and even though everybody wants to get the best items and come up with the best builds, you have to kill tons of monsters to get there. Every class plays very smoothly, every class has a distinct identity, and within that class there's even more different playstyles to experiment with. But every class, the combat just feels good. Yeah, you smash through enemies as a barbarian. Ragdoll physics will hurl enemies away. If monsters are holding weapons, then those will drop realistically. So the ragdoll physics make your killing blows, and the physics in general make the combat very fun, and hopefully combat stays fresh in the long run. So the animations look very good, and it made it very rewarding to chain all abilities together to slay a group of monsters as fast and as efficient as I could. The color palette has been toned down from Diablo 3 and brought back in line with the dark occult vibes that Diablo 2 was known for. Livelier colors are being used, but then it's more to emphasize functional things like different weapon damage types, such as fire or shadow, and it makes those abilities just pop off the screen. For instance, as a rogue, if you've imbued your weapon with poison, then a different skill that might be affected by this will get that color in the heads-up display. Those details are very cool. The combat experience is not just visuals or responsiveness, it's also sound, and the sound design is top-notch. It's the industry standard that Blizzard is known for, slashing or bashing through enemies. All abilities, different enemies and areas, all have great sound effects, and of course the music is very good. Not sure if it's going to be as good as or as iconic as the Diablo 2 music, but it's definitely good. Alright, dungeons. In a game like this, you'll spend lots of time in dungeons. The open world stays the same, which I think is nice, but the 115 dungeons in Diablo 4 are supposed to provide the bulk of the replayability. I'd like to see more variation here. The complexity of the dungeon design is lacking, and knowing right at the start which one of only a couple of bland objective types the dungeon could have, it's boring and uninspiring right from the start when you enter a dungeon. The campaign missions are amazing, but the dungeons really need a rework, in my opinion. Dungeons should also tap into this fantasy of exploration, the promise of loot, and the danger of strong enemies. But it doesn't necessarily need to have all those things every time, otherwise things get predictable and boring. Dungeons don't have to have an objective other than explore the dungeon. If more complexity and randomly generated layers are added, then this sense of exploration will increase. It will also create varying experiences of sometimes immediately finding your way to the dungeon and sometimes taking a bit longer. Dungeon design and lore could expand on that idea of intermittent rewarding. What if, for instance, in only a random few of 115 total dungeons, the bottom of those dungeons connects to a unique, highly rewarding whole new area? So in terms of world building, I'm thinking of the Undercity in Baldur's Gate, or Horizon's Arcane Sanctuary in Diablo 2, or to name a recent example, the Eternal City in Elden Ring. You don't expect to find it, but it's so cool and rewarding to find those locations you didn't know were there, and that kind of intermittent rewarding will make exploring dungeons so much more compelling. Much more can be done, but the dungeons right now just feel bland and don't feel nearly as integrated in the overall world as the campaign, quest line, and areas do. So I understand that this is additional content and that the time window until release is too short, but these are just a couple of ideas of how I think a lot more depth, reward, and mystery could be added to the dungeons. Maybe something to be considered for a seasonal content update or an expansion. So here's the big topic for all action RPG fans, but this point is also relevant for new players who are looking for the best game in the genre, or just want to know if Diablo 4 is any good. If I were to summarize what an action RPG like Diablo is all about, I'd say they're about leveling up your character. Then you get skill points that you can spend on different abilities. These abilities or skills define what your character can do, so how it plays. Slaying monsters will give you items that will strengthen and support your character. And that total package of a character's skills and items, as well as your playstyle, that is what makes up your build. The challenge of an action RPG is to get stronger and come up with the right build to complete the game, and that game should get incrementally harder and harder. Diablo 2 is the godfather of this genre, and games that are now being called the best in the action RPG genre are doing things that I don't always agree with. Many action RPGs have built on the foundations of Diablo 2 with more complexity. They are expanding on, but not necessarily innovating the genre. Complexity in video games does not always equal depth. Some games are so complex that most players will never find out that the gameplay loop is not really rewarding or fun. They're just spending hours to only look for the gear needed for a build instead of actually playing with it. I'm talking about games that require so much time only to get to a point where the build sort of works. You shouldn't need an external guide to play a game, and the build shouldn't only start to get effective 70 levels in. From what I was able to tell from leveling up in the beta, Diablo 4 provides a lot of meaningful player choices in terms of skills, and already very early on you can get a feel for different builds. In fact, on several occasions I ran into a boss that I couldn't solo, and I changed my skills to meet the challenges that this boss was giving me, and it worked. That's a rewarding, much shorter kind of trial and error loop. Diablo 4 seems to aim for a game design where you're being skill checked about your build choices all the time, and that is a lot of fun. Your build choices seem to really matter, and this is also exactly why Diablo 4 has dynamic leveling. All monsters scale to your own level because the game wants you to overcome every challenge, not just by leveling up and then coming back to an area and steamrolling everything, but by needing to make the right build choices in that moment. If you don't have dynamic leveling, then 90% of all areas will not be relevant to you, and sometimes you might not even have the best build, but you're just beating everything or clearing everything because you're just a higher level. And when you're lower level, you might have the right build, but you are just not at the right power level. So this is a very elegant solution to bringing the focus back to the builds. The fact that items don't feel insanely powerful, the fact that you can't manually upgrade your stats, it's all meant to keep the focus on the essential gameplay loop of action RPGs, which is coming up with the right build. The fact that in Diablo 4 you don't have an infinite amount of potions is not some sort of simplification to cater to the casual players. It's putting a time limit on that skill check. So the bottom line is that Diablo 4 seems to be bringing back the focus to meaningful decision making instead of a reliance on overly complex or broken builds that require an insane amount of hours put into the game. And that's why I think at this point in time, with what we can tell from the beta, Diablo 4 is staying closest to the essence of what an action RPG is about. And I hope the developers can keep this philosophy alive post-launch, when we can all go past 25, we can find all items, the Paragon board is unlocked, and much more. I'm really curious to see how all of that develops. I hope that last part didn't get too technical. Let me know if you agree, disagree with anything I said. All opinions are welcome. I'll put some other minor points of beta feedback in the pinned comment. Subscribe if you like this video, and if you would like to see more Diablo content from me. I'm looking forward to Diablo 4, and yeah, hope to see you in the next one.